In a single calendar year, the entertainment industry has come to resemble a ledger of loss. Deaths without clarity. Careers stalled without explanation. Labor unpaid without consequence. Power exercised without visible restraint. At first, these events appeared disconnected, scattered across different headlines and timelines. Yet as the year progressed, a troubling question emerged. What if these were not isolated incidents, but entries on the same, expanding record? But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial mistakes to the irreversible damage, to see how the entertainment world works and how an icon is redefined. From the outside, 2025 looks familiar. The industry has always lived on volatility. Fame rises quickly and falls even faster. Scandals burn brightly, then disappear beneath the next wave of content. Audiences are accustomed to turbulence. What makes this moment different is not the presence of chaos, but its density. Too many events are unfolding at once, and too many of them follow the same emotional pattern. The unease began with the death of Yu Menglong. The official conclusion arrived swiftly, presented with procedural confidence and legal finality. On paper, the case appeared closed. In reality, it never settled. Public discussion did not fade with time. It intensified. Online communities reconstructed timelines. Statements were scrutinized for phrasing rather than meaning. Small inconsistencies, insignificant in isolation, accumulated into a larger sense of incompleteness. What disturbed observers was not only the loss of a young life, but the speed with which the narrative was sealed. When explanations arrive faster than understanding, they often provoke resistance rather than relief. Silence followed where clarification was expected. That silence became louder than any statement. As attention lingered, memory intervened. People began recalling earlier tragedies, moments when the industry promised reform. Safety would be prioritized. Human life would not be secondary to production schedules or ratings. Those assurances now felt distant. The structure appeared unchanged. Exhaustion remained normalized. Pressure remained invisible. Responsibility remained distributed so widely that it effectively vanished. The story slowly expanded beyond one name. It became about repetition, about an environment where outcomes feel predictable even when they are labeled accidental, where loss is framed as misfortune rather than consequence, where individuals are celebrated publicly yet treated as replaceable privately. This is the point where the narrative shifts. The issue is no longer whether a single explanation is accurate. It is whether the system itself encourages transparency or discourages it, whether accountability is built into the design or postponed indefinitely, whether silence is an exception or an expectation. If the entertainment industry prides itself on storytelling, then the most revealing story may be the one it struggles to tell. Not a story of celebrity or scandal, but a story of how power behaves when it is insulated from scrutiny, how narratives are contained, how discomfort is managed, how attention is redirected until memory softens. This investigation does not begin with an accusation. It begins with recognition. Recognition that patterns matter more than statements. Recognition that repetition erodes trust. Recognition that when questions refuse to disappear, it is often because they have not been answered. What follows is not a search for spectacle, but an examination of structure. Because when similar outcomes occur under similar conditions, coincidence becomes an insufficient explanation. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so that our future investigations can continue to illuminate the truths that often remain hidden behind the entertainment industry's brightest lights. Share this video across every platform where voices gather, because collective awareness is the only force capable of demanding accountability. Let us stand together, not in anger, but in clarity and compassion, to ensure that what happened to Yu Menglong is never repeated. Let us raise our voices so that silence can no longer swallow the struggles of those who give so much of themselves to the world. The doubts surrounding the death of Yu Menglong did not begin with evidence. They began with discomfort, a persistent feeling that the story, as presented, was too orderly, too quickly concluded, and emotionally disconnected from the gravity of the loss. The official explanation carried institutional authority, yet it failed to provide psychological closure. Instead of resolution, it produced silence. And silence, when paired with unresolved questions, rarely calms public concern. Attention first gathered around details that appeared trivial. A social media post by Jiao Maiki, written in an oddly casual tone. A brief message whose wording felt imprecise, almost careless. On its own, it suggested nothing. In context, however, it felt misplaced. Timing transformed neutrality into unease. What once seemed irrelevant began to feel adjacent to something larger. Shortly afterward, another detail surfaced. A question posted online about nerve damage and numbness, phrased without explanation or follow-up. Under normal circumstances, it would have passed unnoticed, buried beneath millions of similar queries. But proximity altered perception. When events cluster too closely, coincidence becomes difficult to separate from implication. Some observers dismissed the connection outright, arguing that interpretation was shaped by hindsight. Others believed the question functioned as indirect speech, a cautious way to reference something that could not be stated openly. This division in public reaction revealed a deeper issue. The audience was not demanding sensationalism. It was seeking coherence. When official narratives address outcomes without addressing contradictions, they leave space for alternative interpretations to flourish. These interpretations do not gain traction because they are persuasive, but because they respond to emotional and logical gaps left unfilled. What followed was not an explosion of accusation, but an accumulation of doubt. No comprehensive timeline was released to address inconsistencies being discussed. No detailed clarification engaged directly with the circulating questions. The absence of response allowed speculation to occupy the narrative. Even improbable theories began to feel, to some, more emotionally satisfying than procedural finality. At this point, the question shifted. It was no longer about whether any single detail proved wrongdoing. It became about why the story refused to settle. Most public tragedies eventually recede into memory. This one persisted. It resurfaced repeatedly, not because new information emerged, but because existing information never felt complete. The handling of the case became as significant as the case itself. Institutions often assume that formal conclusion equals closure. In practice, closure is psychological, not administrative. It requires shared understanding. Without that, even accurate explanations fail to persuade. The result is erosion of trust rather than acceptance. As discussion widened, observers began connecting this event to earlier incidents. The similarities were not literal, but structural. In each case, crisis was managed through containment. Statements were issued. Time was allowed to pass. Attention was expected to move on. Reflection remained minimal. Accountability remained abstract. This pattern shifted the focus away from individual behavior and towards systemic behavior. Whether any single action was intentional became secondary. The primary concern was the environment itself. An environment where ambiguity is allowed to linger, where emotional accountability is optional, where trust is treated as renewable, regardless of how often it is strained. The public reaction, then, was not fueled by malice. It was fueled by repetition. When similar outcomes occur under similar conditions, coincidence becomes an insufficient explanation. Patterns demand interpretation. What remains unresolved is not a verdict, but a tension. a sense that truth has not been allowed the space to exist openly. When information is constrained and engagement avoided, speculation becomes the default language. It fills the silence left behind. This is where the analysis must pause. Not at a conclusion, but at a recognition. Recognition that the persistence of doubt is itself meaningful. Recognition that unresolved questions do not disappear through declaration alone. And recognition that when stories refuse to end, it is often because they have not truly been addressed. Suspicion hardened into collective anger, not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. Once uncertainty entered the public space, the media response followed a familiar trajectory. Information multiplied without coherence. Clips circulated detached from context. Old interviews resurfaced. Witness accounts emerged years after the fact. Instead of clarity, the narrative fractured. This was the moment when attention shifted decisively. The conversation stopped revolving solely around Yu Menglong and began to interrogate the industry itself. The death became a trigger rather than the center. Memory-activated comparison. One earlier case returned with particular force. The collapse of Gao Yixiang during filming, once framed as an unfortunate accident, re-entered public consciousness not as history, but as precedent. At the time, statements had been issued swiftly. Regret was expressed. Reforms were promised. The language suggested lessons learned. The structure suggested continuity. As new discussions unfolded, witnesses from that earlier incident began to speak again. Their accounts were not dramatic. They were subdued. Confusion at the scene. Delays that felt insignificant in the moment, but unbearable in retrospect. While some individuals reacted with urgency, others appeared detached, continuing their roles as though production itself could not pause. These recollections resonated because they aligned with a pattern audiences had come to recognize. Long working hours framed as dedication. Physical limits treated as personal responsibility. Pressure normalized as professionalism. In such an environment, collapse is not an anomaly. It is a probability. Media amplification intensified emotion while leaving mechanisms largely unnamed. Headlines focused on loss. Images circulated repeatedly. Yet the processes that placed individuals in harm's way remained abstract. Production schedules were not dissected. Financial incentives were rarely scrutinized. Decision-making stayed off-screen. This imbalance revealed the true function of the media avalanche. It allowed grief to be expressed without demanding reform. Outrage surged, but accountability diffused. The system absorbed attention and continued operating. As coverage expanded, skepticism deepened. Each official explanation was filtered through memory. Each assurance compared against past outcomes. Trust eroded not through cynicism, but through experience. The public did not reject statements because they were implausible, but because they felt incomplete. The timing of this avalanche mattered. Financial strain within the industry was already visible. Projects stalled. Payments delayed. Public disputes over wages began appearing with increasing frequency. When stories of unpaid labor intersected with stories of preventable death, the narrative shifted sharply. Exploitation was no longer theoretical. It became tangible. If contracts could be ignored, what protections truly existed? If recognized figures struggled to receive compensation, what recourse did anonymous workers have? These questions reframed the entire discussion. The avalanche reached its most volatile point when repetition became undeniable. Different years, different names, similar outcomes, similar responses. The pattern suggested not a series of unfortunate events, but a structural tolerance for risk and neglect. At this stage, the media no longer needed new information to sustain momentum. Accumulation itself became evidence of dysfunction. Each unresolved case reinforced the next. Each silence amplified suspicion. The industry appeared unable or unwilling to interrupt its own cycle. What remained was a collective realization. The question was no longer what went wrong this time. It was how often this had been allowed to happen, and why the same mechanisms continued to govern response. The avalanche did not expose a single failure. It exposed repetition. And repetition, once recognized, changes perception permanently. Every future incident becomes part of a larger pattern. Every explanation is weighed against history. This is how trust collapses. Not suddenly, but incrementally. Not through conspiracy, but through continuity. When systems prioritize output over care and narrative containment over reflection, consequence becomes predictable. By the end of this phase, attention had fully shifted. The focus was no longer on isolated tragedy, but on the conditions that make tragedy routine. And once that shift occurs, there is no returning to innocence. The narrative reached its most revealing stage when the focus shifted away from death and toward survival. Those still working inside the industry began to speak, not as symbols of tragedy, but as participants struggling to remain afloat. Their testimonies did not arrive as dramatic exposés. They arrived as weary admissions. Payments delayed without explanation. Contracts honored only in language. Silence used as a management tool. Actors and directors, once shielded by visibility and prestige, found themselves publicly negotiating for wages already earned. Their words carried fatigue rather than outrage. They described familiar cycles. Funds had not been transferred. Platforms had not settled accounts. Promises were repeated. Deadlines dissolved. When pressure increased, communication stopped. What made these stories unsettling was not their novelty, but their normality. This visibility altered perception. If recognized figures could not secure basic compensation, the conditions faced by anonymous workers became impossible to ignore. The glamour associated with the industry dissolved under scrutiny. What remained was a hierarchy of dependence where power accumulated at the top while risk and instability flowed downward. As financial strain intensified, deeper power dynamics surfaced. Opportunities were no longer framed as employment, but as generosity. Access to resources became personalized. Boundaries blurred quietly. Advancement depended less on merit than on compliance. Refusal did not require explicit punishment. Consequences appeared as absence. Calls not returned. Projects delayed indefinitely. Invitations that never arrived. This structure explains the persistence of silence. Speaking out does not challenge a single decision-maker. It disrupts an entire network. Careers stall without explanation. Reputations fade without confrontation. In such an environment, survival often depends on strategic invisibility. Compliance becomes self-protection. The convergence of earlier elements now became unmistakable. Deaths raised unresolved questions. Media amplification revived memory. Wage disputes exposed vulnerability. Power relations clarified motive. Together, they formed a single realization. These outcomes were not random. They were produced. When power operates without accountability, harm becomes procedural. Not intentional in every instance, but inevitable over time. Schedules reward endurance. Contracts prioritize control. Reputation management favors continuity. Human cost becomes externalized, categorized as misfortune rather than consequence. This is where the narrative breaks through its earlier limitations. The story no longer depends on uncovering a hidden truth. It depends on recognizing a visible pattern. The most unsettling aspect is not secrecy, but tolerance. Tolerance for exhaustion. Tolerance for imbalance. Tolerance for loss framed as inevitability. Systems reveal their values through repetition. When silence is rewarded and transparency discouraged, outcomes stabilize around harm. Collapse does not signal failure. It signals design reaching its logical conclusion. Reform, under these conditions, is delayed rather than prevented. The breakthrough, then, is not emotional. It is structural. It requires shifting attention away from individual blame and toward institutional configuration, away from singular events and toward recurring conditions, away from spectacle and toward persistence. For audiences, this realization introduces discomfort. Consumption is not neutral. Attention sustains ecosystems. Silence functions as efficiency. Outrage fades quickly, but structures endure. Meaningful change demands forces that move more slowly. Documentation, legal clarity, economic pressure. These forces lack spectacle, but they alter behavior. History suggests that industries do not reform because they are shocked. They reform when shock becomes cost. When memory persists beyond cycles of attention, when forgetting becomes inconvenient, the individuals referenced throughout this narrative are not metaphors. They are people navigating an environment shaped long before they entered it. Their experiences differ. Their outcomes vary. What unites them is context. A context that reframes endurance as professionalism, coercion as opportunity, and silence as maturity. The question that remains is not whether this system will change, but when. And whether that change will arrive before repetition claims more ground. Because when power is absolute and unaccountable, tragedy is not an accident. It is an outcome. What remains after the headlines fade is not a single conclusion, but a collective unease. Names will be remembered. Specific moments will be replayed. Yet the deeper impact lies elsewhere. It lies in the recognition that these events do not exist in isolation. They coexist within the same framework, shaped by the same incentives, and managed through the same habits of silence. The past year forced an uncomfortable confrontation. Death appeared alongside debt. Opportunity appeared alongside coercion. Public celebration existed beside private disposability. These contradictions were not hidden. They were visible, repeated, and increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. For years, the industry relied on speed to outrun accountability. Controversy would flare, then fade. Memory would soften. Attention would move on. That rhythm no longer holds. Digital records persist. Witnesses resurface. Patterns are compared across time. Each attempt to close a narrative prematurely now creates more doubt rather than relief. This examination does not claim certainty, nor does it assign final judgment. Its purpose is more restrained, and perhaps more unsettling. It asks why so many explanations feel incomplete. Why responsibility so often dissolves into abstraction. Why human cost is treated as collateral rather than consequence. The answer suggested by repetition points towards structure. Structures determine what is rewarded, what is tolerated, and what is sacrificed. When efficiency outweighs care, when silence is mistaken for professionalism, and when power operates without sustained scrutiny, harm becomes predictable. Not inevitable in every instance, but increasingly normalized. For those within the system, survival often requires adaptation. Compromise becomes routine. Silence becomes strategic. For those outside it, consumption becomes detached from consequence. This is how imbalance sustains itself. Not through conspiracy, but through convenience. Yet convenience has limits. Public memory functions as pressure, even when it is quiet. Every unresolved question lingers. Every delayed payment leaves a trace. Every avoided responsibility accumulates. Over time, these traces form a record that cannot be dismissed as anecdotal. Change, if it comes, will not arrive through outrage alone. Outrage burns quickly. What endures is attention, documentation, the refusal to forget. These forces move slowly, but they reshape systems more effectively than shock ever could. The individuals whose lives intersected with this narrative are not symbols. They are people navigating an environment shaped long before they entered it. Their experiences differ. Their outcomes vary. What unites them is context. A context that reframes endurance as virtue, imbalance as inevitability, and silence as maturity. The question that remains is not whether this system will change, but when, and whether that change will arrive before repetition claims more ground. Because forgetting is no longer automatic. It is a choice. Truth does not disappear. It waits. And the longer it is buried, the more destructive it becomes when it resurfaces.